The last day of the plantation did not begin with noise or chaos. It began quietly, almost peacefully. The sun rose slowly over the fields, casting a pale golden light across land that had once been full of life. Rows of cotton that had once stretched across the horizon now lay thin and uneven. Parts of the fields had already turned into wild grass, and the wooden fences that once marked the property lines were beginning to rot and fall apart. The main house still stood on the hill, tall and white, but time had begun to leave its mark on it. The paint was peeling. The shutters hung slightly crooked. The long front porch, where guests once laughed and drank sweet tea in the evenings, now sat empty, collecting dust and silence. For nearly 50 years, this plantation had been one of the richest in the county. People used to speak the family name with respect. They owned land, workers, livestock, and more cotton than most men could count. Wagons used to come and go every day, carrying supplies, cotton, and visitors. But that morning, no wagons came. No workers filled the fields. No voices echoed across the land, because the plantation was dying. Inside the big house, furniture had already been covered with white sheets. Several rooms were completely empty now, their furniture sold weeks earlier to pay off debts. The large dining room, where 10 people once sat every night, now held only a single table and 2 chairs. The owner of the plantation, an aging man named Henry Caldwell, sat alone at that table, reading a letter for what was probably the 10th time. The letter was short, cold, official. It informed him that the bank was taking the remaining land within the month. The debts had become too large. The cotton harvest had failed 2 years in a row, and the railroad had changed its route, cutting off the fastest way to transport goods to the city. Without money, without buyers, and without help, the plantation had slowly collapsed. Henry Caldwell folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. His hands moved slowly, like a man who was very tired. Outside, the last group of workers was being prepared to leave. A trader had come the day before and bought several of them. Others had already been taken weeks earlier. Families had been separated. Wagons had carried people away. And one by one, the small cabins near the fields had become empty. By the end of that week, almost everyone would be gone. Almost everyone. Because there was one man who was not leaving. He was not sold. He was not on any list. And no one seemed to know why. His name was Elijah. He was not young anymore. His hair had begun to turn gray, and his face carried the deep lines of a man who had lived a long and difficult life. He worked like the others, spoke very little, and never caused trouble. For many years, people barely noticed him because he kept to himself and did his work quietly. But now, when everyone else was being sold and sent away, people began to notice something strange. Every time a buyer came and looked at the workers, Elijah was never brought forward. His name was never mentioned. When people were counted, he was not counted. When papers were written, his name was not written. It was as if he did not exist. On that last morning, Elijah was standing near the edge of the field, repairing a broken section of fence. The wood was old and weak, and every time he hammered a nail into it, part of the wood cracked a little more. It was work that did not really matter anymore. The land would soon belong to someone else. But Elijah worked anyway, as if nothing had changed, as if the plantation was not collapsing around him, as if he had nowhere else to go. From the porch of the big house, Henry Caldwell watched him from a distance. He had been watching him like that for many mornings now, silently, without calling out to him, without giving any orders, just watching. There was something unusual in the way Henry looked at Elijah. It was not the way a master looked at a worker. It was something else, something heavier, something that looked almost like guilt, or maybe like a memory that refused to disappear. Later that afternoon, a wagon arrived to take away the last pieces of furniture that had been sold. 2 men carried out a large wooden cabinet, a dining table, and several chairs. The house began to look emptier with every trip they made to the wagon. Elijah saw the wagon from the field, but he did not stop working. A young boy who had been sold the previous week was being allowed to say goodbye to his mother before leaving. The sound of quiet crying carried across the yard. These were the kinds of sounds that had become common on the plantation over the past few months. Quiet goodbyes, wagon wheels, and the sound of doors closing. But still, Elijah was not called. As the sun began to set, Henry Caldwell finally walked down from the house and across the field toward Elijah. His steps were slow, and he walked with a cane now, his health not as strong as it once had been. Elijah saw him coming and stopped working. He removed his hat and waited quietly. For a few moments, Henry said nothing. He simply looked at the broken fence, then at the empty fields, then back at Elijah. "It won't matter much now," Henry said quietly, looking at the fence. "This land won't be mine in a few weeks." Elijah nodded once, but did not speak. Henry looked at him for a long moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but did not know how. "The others will be gone by tomorrow," Henry finally said. "The trader is coming back in the morning." Elijah nodded again. Still silent, Henry gripped his cane a little tighter and then said something strange. "You are not on the list," he said. Elijah did not look surprised. He did not look confused. He simply looked at Henry and waited. "You were never on the list," Henry continued. "Not when I sold the North Field. Not when I sold the horses. Not when I sold the others." The evening wind moved slowly through the dry fields, making a soft rustling sound in the remaining cotton plants. "Do you know why?" Henry asked. Elijah looked down at the ground for a moment, then back at Henry. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. Henry nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sky was turning orange now as the sun moved toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The big house on the hill cast the longest shadow of all, stretching across the field like a dark memory that refused to leave. "You could leave, you know," Henry said after a while. "When the bank takes the land, you will be a free man." Elijah looked out across the fields, toward the small cabins, where almost everyone had already left. Then he said something very simple. "I know," he said, but he did not say he would leave. Henry seemed to understand this. He nodded slowly again, then turned and began walking back toward the house. After a few steps, he stopped and spoke without turning around. "I made a promise a long time ago," Henry said, "and I intend to keep it, even now." Then he continued walking toward the house, leaving Elijah standing alone by the broken fence. That night, the plantation was quieter than it had ever been. Most of the cabins were empty now. The fields were dark. The big house had only one light burning in an upstairs window, and in a small cabin near the far edge of the property, Elijah sat alone, holding an old piece of paper in his hands, a paper that he had kept hidden for many years, a paper with a signature on it, a promise written in ink, a promise that explained why he was the only one who was never sold. But that story, that promise, that secret, would only be revealed many years later, after the plantation was gone, after the house was empty, and after most of the people who knew the truth were dead. Because some promises are not meant to be understood when they are made. Some promises only make sense at the very end. And the story of Elijah, the slave who was never sold, was a story that began with a promise and ended with a secret. After the plantation fell silent, most people expected the land to become completely empty. That is what usually happened when a plantation collapsed. The owner left, the workers were taken away, the house was abandoned, and within a few years, nature slowly erased everything. Roads disappeared under grass, fences collapsed, and the land forgot the people who once lived there. But this plantation did not become completely empty, because Elijah stayed. At first, people from the nearby town did not notice. The plantation was far from the main road, and after the bank took the land, very few people had a reason to go there. The big house was locked, the fields were unused, and the cabins were empty. But sometimes, travelers passing by the old road would see a thin line of smoke rising in the distance. Smoke meant a fire. Fire meant someone was there. At first, people thought it might be thieves, or maybe travelers using the land for shelter. But then a local boy who had gone hunting near the old property came back to town with a strange story. He said he saw a man working in the old fields, alone. The boy said the man was repairing fences that no longer mattered and clearing weeds from land that no longer belonged to anyone who lived there. He said the man moved slowly, like someone much older than he looked, and he worked quietly, without singing, without talking, without stopping. The people in town asked the boy what the man looked like. The boy said, "He looks like he belongs there." A few days later, another man passing by the property saw the same thing. A lone figure walking near the fields early in the morning, carrying a bucket toward the old well. Then someone else said they saw a light in one of the small cabins at night. That is when people began to realize something strange. The plantation was not empty. Elijah was still there. The news spread slowly through the town, the way quiet stories always do. People talked about it in the general store, outside the church, and near the blacksmith shop. "The Caldwell place is not empty," someone said. "Who would stay there?" another man asked. Then an older man in the town, who had once delivered supplies to the plantation many years ago, said something that made everyone quiet. "There was a man there," he said. "A quiet one. Worked in the fields. Kept to himself. I think his name was Elijah." "But why would he stay?" someone asked. The old man shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he said. "But I remember something. The owner treated him differently." That was the first time people began to think that maybe Elijah was not staying because he had nowhere to go. Maybe he was staying because he chose to stay. Years earlier, when the plantation was still running, Elijah had been known as one of the most reliable workers on the land. He woke before sunrise, worked until dark, and never argued, never caused trouble, never tried to run away. Some people said he was just a quiet man. Others said he was a broken man. But a few people who had worked on the plantation long ago remembered something else. They remembered that sometimes, late at night, Elijah would be called to the big house. Not for punishment, not for work, just called to the house. And sometimes he would stay there for a long time. No one knew why. Some of the older workers used to whisper that Elijah knew something about the Caldwell family. Something important. Something that made the owner trust him more than the others. But no one ever knew the full story. And Elijah never spoke about it. Back in the present, months after the plantation had collapsed, a banker's representative finally came to inspect the property. The bank planned to sell the land to a new owner, and they needed to see what condition everything was in. When the man arrived, he rode his horse up the long dirt road toward the big house. The road was rough now, with grass growing in the middle where wagon wheels once rolled every day. As he approached, he noticed something strange immediately. Someone had cleared the road. The weeds had been cut back. Broken branches had been moved aside. The path, although old, was still walkable. That meant someone had been maintaining it. The man reached the big house and found it locked, just as expected. But when he walked around the side of the property toward the old cabins, he saw something that surprised him. One of the cabins had smoke coming from the chimney. He walked closer, slowly, not sure who he would find. When he reached the cabin, he saw Elijah sitting outside on a wooden chair, repairing an old tool handle with a knife. Elijah looked up as the man approached, but he did not stand, did not run, did not look afraid. He simply watched. The banker's man stopped a few steps away and said, "This property belongs to the bank now. What are you doing here?" Elijah looked at the land around him before answering. "I'm taking care of it," he said. The man frowned. "Why?" Elijah thought for a moment, as if the answer was not simple. "Because someone should," he said. The banker's man did not know what to say to that. He had expected to find a thief or a squatter, not a man calmly repairing tools and maintaining land that he did not own. "You can't stay here forever," the man said. "This land will be sold." Elijah nodded. "I know." "Then why stay?" the man asked. Elijah looked toward the big house on the hill. Its white paint was now more gray than white, and several windows were broken. It looked less like a home now, and more like a memory. Then Elijah said something the man would later repeat many times to people in town. "I gave my word," Elijah said quietly, "and I don't leave until a promise is finished." The banker's man asked, "What promise?" But Elijah did not answer that question. Instead, he stood up, picked up his tools, and walked toward the field, leaving the man standing there alone with more questions than answers. When the banker's man returned to town, he told everyone what he had seen. He said he made a promise. The man told the people at the general store. He said he can't leave because of a promise. "What kind of promise makes a man stay on land that isn't his?" someone asked. No one had an answer, but now the story was spreading faster. The story of the man who stayed on the plantation even after the plantation was gone. Seasons began to change. Summer turned into autumn, and autumn turned into winter. Snow fell lightly across the empty fields, covering the rows where cotton once grew. And still Elijah stayed. People who passed by during winter said they saw him carrying firewood, fixing the roof of the small cabin, and sometimes standing on the hill near the big house, just looking at it, as if he was guarding it, or remembering something. Years passed, and the big house slowly began to fall apart. Part of the porch roof collapsed. More windows broke. The fields became wild and uneven. But one small area near Elijah's cabin remained clean and cared for. It was as if a small part of the plantation was still alive while the rest slowly disappeared. Children in the town began to grow up hearing stories about him. They called him the man who never left. Some people said he was crazy. Some people said he was cursed. Some people said he was waiting for someone to come back. But the truth was much simpler and much heavier. Elijah was not waiting for someone to come back. He was staying because of something that happened many years ago. Something that involved the Caldwell family. Something that involved a promise. And a promise, once given, was something Elijah believed could not be broken. Even if the world around him collapsed. Even if the land was sold. Even if the house fell apart. And even if everyone else forgot what had happened there. He remembered. And that was why he stayed. Because sometimes, a man is not tied to a place by chains. Sometimes, he is tied to a place by a promise. And Elijah had made a promise that would keep him on that land for the rest of his life. But the people in town did not know that yet. They only knew the mystery. They only knew the story. The story of the man who never left. That'd be why the time people in town started calling Elijah the man who never left. The Caldwell plantation had already begun to disappear into history. The wooden fences that once marked the property had mostly fallen. The fields had turned wild, covered in tall grass and weeds. The cabins where dozens of people once lived were now empty shells, their doors broken, their windows open to the wind. But the big house still stood on the hill. Barely. Its white paint had almost completely faded, and dark stains from years of rain ran down the walls like long shadows. The front porch, once the heart of the house, had partially collapsed on one side. The long windows were broken. And when the wind blew at night, people said the house made low, hollow sounds, like it was breathing. Some people in town began to avoid the road that passed near the property after sunset. They said the place felt wrong. Not haunted exactly, but heavy. As if something had happened there that the land did not want to forget. And in a way, they were right. Because the story of Elijah and the reason he was never sold did not begin when the plantation collapsed. It began many years earlier, when the plantation was still rich, still powerful, and still full of life. Back then, Henry Caldwell was not a tired old man walking with a cane. He was strong, respected, and feared in equal measure. He was known as a hard man, but a fair one by the standards of that time. He ran the plantation strictly, expected work to be done properly, and did not tolerate theft or laziness. But there was one strange thing people noticed even back then. Henry Caldwell trusted Elijah more than anyone else on the plantation. At first, this did not seem unusual. Every plantation owner had one or two workers they trusted more than the others. Men who were given extra responsibilities. Men who worked near the house. Men who delivered messages or handled tools and animals. But Elijah was different. Elijah was sometimes sent into town alone to deliver letters. He was sometimes called to the big house late at night, long after the other workers had returned to their cabins. And once, a man who worked in the stable said he saw Elijah and Henry Caldwell sitting on the porch together, talking quietly like two men who were discussing something important. Not like a master talking to a worker, but like two men talking as equals. The stable worker told this story years later, and most people did not believe him. In those days, men like Henry Caldwell did not sit and talk as equals with men like Elijah. But the stable worker insisted. "I know what I saw," he said. "They weren't talking like master and slave. They were talking like two men who shared something." At the time, no one understood what that meant. But years later, after the plantation was gone and Elijah was still there alone, people began to remember small details like that. Small moments that did not make sense at the time, but started to make sense when seen from a distance. One of those details involved Henry Caldwell's son, Thomas Caldwell. Thomas was about 10 years old when the event happened, the event that would change Elijah's life and tie his future to the Caldwell family forever. It was a hot summer afternoon, many years before the plantation collapsed. The fields were busy, the house was full of guests, and Thomas, like many boys his age, was not supposed to go near the river that ran along the far edge of the property. The river looked calm on the surface, but it was deeper than it looked, and the current was strong in certain places. Thomas went anyway. No one saw him leave the house. No one saw him walk through the fields. And no one noticed he was missing for almost an hour. The first person who realized something was wrong was Henry Caldwell's wife. She asked one of the house servants where Thomas was, and no one could answer. They searched the house first, then the yard, then the nearby cabins. Then someone said they had seen the boy walking toward the fields earlier. Within minutes, several men began searching the property. They called his name, checked the barns, the storage buildings, and the road. But it was Elijah who thought of the river. Later, Elijah would say he did not know why he thought of it. He just had a feeling. He left the field where he was working and walked quickly through the trees toward the water. When he reached the riverbank, he saw something that made him run. Thomas Caldwell was in the water, struggling, his head going under again and again as the current pulled him away from the shallow edge. The boy could not swim, and every time he tried to grab something, his hand slipped on the wet rocks. Elijah did not stop to think. He did not stop to call for help. He jumped into the river. The water was colder than he expected, and the current was strong, but he forced himself forward, fighting the water until he reached the boy. Thomas was panicking, grabbing at Elijah, pulling both of them under the water more than once. It took everything Elijah had to keep the boy's head above water and push him toward the shallow edge of the river. By the time they reached land, Elijah was exhausted, and Thomas was barely conscious. By the time the others arrived, Elijah was sitting on the riverbank, breathing heavily, while Thomas lay on the ground, coughing and crying but alive. Henry Caldwell arrived a few minutes later. He saw his son on the ground, his wife crying beside him, and Elijah sitting a few feet away, completely soaked, his hands shaking from exhaustion. Henry Caldwell looked at his son. Then he looked at Elijah, and in that moment, something passed between the two men, something that no one else fully understood. Henry Caldwell walked over to Elijah and said only one sentence, "You saved my son." Elijah did not respond. He just looked down at the ground. Henry stood there for a long moment, then said something else, something very few people heard, because he said it quietly. "As long as I live," Henry said, "you will never be sold." Those words did not seem important to the people who heard them at the time. It sounded like something a grateful father would say in a moment of emotion. But Henry Caldwell was not a man who spoke lightly, and he was not a man who forgot a promise. Years passed after that day, and life on the plantation continued. Thomas Caldwell grew older. Elijah continued working. The fields continued producing cotton. The house remained full of life and activity. But from that day forward, Elijah's life was different in small, quiet ways. He was never whipped. He was never sold when others were sold. He was given work closer to the house as he grew older. And sometimes, late at night, a light would be seen on the Caldwell porch, and two figures would be sitting there, Henry Caldwell and Elijah, talking quietly while the rest of the plantation slept. No one knew what they talked about, but whatever it was, it lasted for years. Then time did what time always does. It changed everything. The harvest began to fail. Money became tight. Debts began to grow. And slowly, piece by piece, Henry Caldwell began selling everything he could to keep the plantation alive. He sold land first, then animals, then furniture, then workers. Families were separated. Wagons carried people away. The plantation became quieter and poorer with each passing year. But through all of it, Elijah was never sold. Buyers asked about him. Henry always gave the same answer. He is not for sale. At first, buyers thought Henry was just being stubborn. But later, when Henry became desperate for money and still refused to sell Elijah, people began to realize something unusual was happening. Henry Caldwell was a man losing everything, but he still kept his promise, even when it cost him money. even when it made no business sense, even when the plantation was collapsing around him. Because some promises, once made, are not business. Some promises are personal. And Elijah was not still on that land because he was forgotten. He was still there because Henry Caldwell had made a promise by a river many years earlier. A promise that would outlive the plantation. A promise that would outlive the house. A promise that would turn Elijah into the man who never left. That'd be why the time most people in the town began telling the story of Elijah. The plantation had already become a place people only talked about in past tense. They would say, "Up that road there used to be a big plantation. Used to be a rich family there. Used to be a lot of people living on that land." Used to. The Caldwell plantation had become a memory, and like all memories, parts of it were slowly fading while other parts were becoming stories. But there was one part of that story that almost no one knew. Not in full, not clearly, not the way it really happened. Because the day Elijah saved Thomas Caldwell from the river was not the only day that tied his life to the Caldwell family. There was another night. A night that was never written in any record, never spoken about in public, and never fully explained while Henry Caldwell was alive. It happened about 3 years after the river incident. At that time, the plantation was still doing well. The harvest had been good, the house was full, and Thomas Caldwell was now a teenager, old enough to ride into town alone, old enough to think he understood the world, and young enough to make dangerous mistakes. One evening, Thomas rode into town with 2 friends. They were supposed to return before dark, but night came, and Thomas did not return. At first, no one worried. Young men often stayed in town longer than they were supposed to. But when midnight passed and Thomas still had not returned, Henry Caldwell began to worry. By morning, worry had turned into fear. Henry rode into town and began asking questions. Most people said they had seen Thomas the night before near the saloon. One man said Thomas and his friends had been drinking. Another said there had been an argument between Thomas and another young man. But no one could say where Thomas was now. Henry Caldwell returned to the plantation with a look on his face that the workers had never seen before. Not anger, not authority, fear. He organized a search immediately. Men searched the road between the town and the plantation. They searched the woods, the riverbank, and the fields. But it was Elijah who found the horse. Thomas's horse was wandering near a wooded area not far from the main road. The saddle was still on the horse, but there was no rider. Elijah examined the ground and saw marks, signs that there had been a struggle. Broken branches, footprints, drag marks in the dirt. Something bad had happened there. Elijah followed the drag marks into the trees, moving slowly and carefully. After about 10 minutes of walking through the woods, he found Thomas. The boy was alive, but barely. He was lying on the ground, his face bruised, his clothes torn, and there was blood on his shirt. He had been beaten badly and left there. Elijah lifted him carefully and carried him back toward the road, where the others found them. Thomas survived, but he was unconscious for 2 days. When he finally woke up, he told a story. He said he had argued with a man in town, a man named Robert Hayes, the son of another landowner who had always been in competition with the Caldwell family. The argument had started over money and pride, but it had turned into something worse. Thomas said Robert Hayes and 2 other men had followed him when he left town. They had stopped him on the road, pulled him from his horse, and beaten him. Henry Caldwell listened to the story in silence. Then he asked one question. "Can you prove it?" he asked. Thomas did not answer, because in those days, accusations like that could start feuds between powerful families, feuds that could last for years and destroy what was left of a man's business and reputation. There were no witnesses, no proof, only Thomas's word, and that was not enough to start a war between families. So publicly, nothing happened, but privately, something did. A week after Thomas recovered, Henry Caldwell called Elijah to the big house late at night. No one heard the conversation that took place in that room. But years later, after Henry Caldwell died, a paper was found among his private documents, a paper written in his own handwriting, sealed in an envelope with Elijah's name on it. The paper told the truth about that night. It said that Thomas Caldwell had not told the full story. The argument in town had not been about money. It had been about a girl. Thomas had been drinking. He had insulted Robert Hayes publicly, and the argument had turned violent. In the fight, Thomas had struck Robert Hayes with a bottle, cutting his face badly. If Robert Hayes had died from that injury, Thomas Caldwell could have been charged with murder. So when Robert Hayes and his friend stopped Thomas on the road that night, they had not planned to kill him. They had planned to beat him and scare him. But the beating went too far. And if the truth had come out, if people had known that Henry Caldwell's son had started the fight and nearly killed another man, the Caldwell family name would have been destroyed. Their reputation, their business, their position in the county, everything would have been gone. So Henry Caldwell made a decision, a terrible decision. According to the paper found years later, Henry Caldwell paid a visit to Robert Hayes's father late one night. No one knows exactly what was said in that meeting, but after that night, the Hayes family never spoke about the incident again. No charges were made. No accusations were spoken. The story disappeared. But there was still one problem. Someone else knew the truth. Elijah. Elijah had found Thomas in the woods. Elijah had seen the broken bottle near the road. Elijah had seen the blood that did not belong only to Thomas. Elijah knew that Thomas had not been an innocent victim. He knew the fight had gone both ways. He knew the Caldwell family secret. And Henry Caldwell knew that Elijah knew. That was the second promise. The paper Henry wrote explained everything in one paragraph. It said, "This man has saved my son twice. Once from death in the river, and once from the consequences of his own actions. He knows the truth about my family, and he has chosen to remain silent. I owe him more than his freedom. I owe him a debt that cannot be measured in money. As long as I live, he will never be sold. And when I die, this paper will prove that he was never meant to be owned." That paper was never shown to Elijah while Henry was alive. But Henry kept it, hidden, sealed, waiting for the day when the truth would need to be told. And Elijah never spoke about that night. Not when the plantation was rich. Not when the plantation was poor. Not when everyone else was being sold. Not even when he was the only one left on the land. He kept the secret. And Henry Caldwell kept his promise. That is why, when the plantation collapsed and everything else was sold, the land, the house, the animals, the furniture, the lives of dozens of people, Elijah was the one thing Henry Caldwell refused to sell. Because Elijah was not just a worker. He was the man who had saved his son. And he was the man who was carrying the Caldwell family's darkest secret. And some secrets are worth more than land. Some secrets are worth more than money. Some secrets are worth a man's entire fortune. And Henry Caldwell had lost his fortune. But he never sold Elijah. Because Elijah was the only man who knew the truth. And the truth was the most valuable thing Henry Caldwell had left. That be why the time the Caldwell plantation finally collapsed, it did not happen all at once. It happened slowly. So slowly that people who lived there did not notice the end when it first began. They thought it was just a bad year. Then a bad few years. Then bad luck. But it was not bad luck. It was the end of a way of life that had lasted for generations. And the Caldwell plantation was simply one of many that did not survive the change. The first sign was the harvest. For years, the cotton fields had produced enough to keep the plantation running. Not just running, but growing. The Caldwell name had once meant something in the county. They were not the richest family, but they were respected, and their land seemed endless. Then one year, the rain came too late. The crop was weak. The next year, the rain came too much. The crop rotted in parts of the field before it could be picked. Then the railroad company built a new line, but not near the Caldwell land. The new route cut transport time for other plantations, but for Caldwell, it meant higher costs and longer travel to sell their cotton. Less profit, more debt. Henry Caldwell began borrowing money to keep the plantation running, believing that next year would be better. Next year was not better. Next year was worse. The debts grew slowly at first, then all at once. Interest piled on top of interest. The bank began sending letters, polite at first, then less polite, then cold and official. Henry Caldwell began selling pieces of land to pay the debts. At first, he sold land far from the main house. Land he told himself he did not really need. Then he sold animals. Then he sold equipment. Then he sold people. Wagons began coming to the plantation more often, but they were not bringing supplies anymore. They were taking people away. Families were separated in the yard in front of the big house. Names were called. Papers were signed. Money changed hands. And then wagons rolled away, carrying people who had lived on that land their entire lives. Through all of this, Elijah watched quietly. He watched people he had known for years leave one by one. He watched cabins become empty. He watched fields grow quiet. He watched the big house become darker at night as fewer lamps were lit. But he never packed his things, because he knew something the others did not. He knew Henry Caldwell would never sell him. One evening, near the end, when only a few workers remained on the plantation, Elijah was called to the big house again. Henry Caldwell was older now, his hair gray, his hands unsteady. The house around him felt too large now, too empty. Rooms that were once full of voices were now silent. Henry was sitting at his desk when Elijah entered. On the desk were papers, many papers, letters from the bank, lists of debts, and documents showing land that had already been sold. Henry looked at Elijah for a long moment before speaking. "I suppose you know what is happening," Henry said. "Yes, sir," Elijah replied. "The bank will take the rest soon," Henry said. "The house, the land, everything." Elijah did not respond. Henry opened a drawer in the desk and took out a folded paper. He looked at it for a moment, but did not hand it over yet. "I made you a promise," Henry said, "many years ago." "Yes, sir," Elijah said again. "I have broken many things in my life," Henry continued. "Business deals, friendships, even parts of my own family. But I have never broken a promise. Not one." He placed the folded paper on the desk. "When they came to buy the others," Henry said, "they asked about you. They offered good money. Very good money. Enough to pay part of my debt." He paused for a moment, but I told them no. Elijah stood quietly, his hands at his sides. "You could have sold me," Elijah said quietly. "No one would have questioned it." Henry shook his head slowly. "That is not true," Henry said. "One person would have questioned it." He tapped the paper on the desk. "Me," he said. Henry pushed the paper across the desk toward Elijah. "This is for you," he said, "but you cannot use it yet. Not until I am gone." Elijah picked up the paper slowly, but did not open it. "What is it?" he asked. "It is your freedom," Henry said. "Written and signed. Legally. When I am gone, no one will be able to claim you. No one will be able to sell you. No one will be able to tell you where to go." Elijah looked down at the paper in his hands. "You should leave when that day comes," Henry said. "Go north. Start a new life. Forget this place." Elijah was quiet for a long time. Then he asked a question Henry did not expect. "What about the house?" Elijah asked. Henry looked around the large, quiet room. "The house will belong to the bank," he said, "and then to someone else, and then to someone else after that. Houses don't belong to families forever. They just pass through our hands." Elijah nodded slowly, but he did not say he would leave. Over the next few months, the last of the workers were sold. The last fields stopped producing. The last animals were taken away. The plantation became quiet, very quiet. Then one morning, a wagon came not to take something away, but to take Henry Caldwell away. He was too sick to continue living alone in the big house, and his relatives in another state had agreed to take him in. He was leaving the plantation for the last time. As the wagon was being loaded with his few remaining belongings, Henry asked to speak with Elijah one last time. They stood in the yard in front of the big house, the same place where so many people had been sold and taken away. Henry looked older than Elijah had ever seen him. "I suppose this is goodbye," Henry said. Elijah nodded. "You should come with me," Henry said suddenly. "You are free now. You don't have to stay here." Elijah looked out across the empty land, the fields, the cabins, the broken fences, the big house on the hill. Then he said something Henry would remember for the rest of his life. "You made me a promise," Elijah said. "Now I am making you one." Henry frowned slightly. "What promise?" "I will stay," Elijah said. "I will take care of what is left. Until the end." "There is nothing left," Henry said. Elijah shook his head slowly. "There are still memories," he said. Henry looked at him for a long time, then nodded once. "Then I suppose this land will have one last caretaker," Henry said. He held out his hand. After a moment, Elijah shook it. Not like a master, not like a worker, but like two men who had shared a secret for most of their lives. Henry Caldwell left the plantation that day and never returned. Within a year, the bank took the land officially. The big house was locked. The fields were abandoned. The cabins fell apart. But Elijah stayed. He repaired fences that no longer held animals. He cleared roads that no wagons used. He fixed roofs on cabins where no families lived. People who passed by said they sometimes saw him standing on the hill near the big house at sunset, just looking at the land as if he was remembering what it used to be. The plantation had collapsed. The Caldwell family was gone. The workers were gone. The money was gone. The cotton was gone. Everything was gone. Everything except one man. The man who was never sold. The man who never left. Because he had made a promise. And some men, once they give their word, will hold on to that promise, even if everything else in their world disappears. For many years after the Caldwell plantation was abandoned, the land remained quiet. The big house stood on the hill like an old memory that refused to disappear. Windows were broken by storms, paint peeled from the walls, and the long road leading to the house slowly disappeared under grass and dust. People in town stopped talking about the Caldwells the way they once had. New families had moved into the area. New businesses had opened. The world was changing, and the Caldwell plantation had become just another forgotten place that people pointed at when telling old stories. But Elijah was still there. People saw him sometimes in town, older now. His hair gray, his walk slower, but still steady. He would come into town for supplies, speak very little, and then return to the old plantation road before sunset. Some people asked him why he still lived there. He always gave the same answer. I'm just looking after what's left. Most people assumed he meant the land, the buildings, the graves behind the church. But Elijah was not looking after the land. He was looking after a promise. Years passed, and then one winter, news came to the town that Henry Caldwell had died in another state, far from the land where he had spent most of his life. The news did not affect many people in town, but it affected one man very much. A few weeks after Henry Caldwell's death, a lawyer arrived in town asking for Elijah. The lawyer's name was Mr. Whitaker, and he carried a small wooden box with him, a box that had belonged to Henry Caldwell. Inside the box were papers, letters, and one sealed envelope with a name written on it. Elijah. The lawyer found Elijah sitting outside a small cabin near the old plantation. The cabin was old but well maintained. The fence around it had been repaired many times. A small garden grew beside the house, even though most of the plantation land around it had returned to wild grass and trees. Are you Elijah? The lawyer asked. Yes, Elijah replied. I have something that belonged to Henry Caldwell, the lawyer said. He left instructions that it was to be given to you after his death. Elijah looked at the wooden box, but did not reach for it immediately. He said you would understand what it is, the lawyer continued. Elijah finally took the box and placed it on the small table beside his chair. Thank you, he said quietly. The lawyer nodded and left, not knowing that he had just delivered the final piece of a story that had begun more than 30 years earlier. Elijah did not open the box right away. Instead, he sat there for a long time, looking out at the land. Finally, as the sun began to set, he opened it. Inside were several documents, property records, old letters, and the sealed envelope Henry had once shown him in the study many years ago. The envelope with his name on it. Elijah opened it slowly. Inside was a letter written in Henry Caldwell's handwriting, along with an official document stamped and signed. The official document was Elijah's freedom paper, legal proof that he was a free man and had been for many years. But it was the letter that mattered most. Elijah sat down and began to read. The letter was long, longer than Elijah expected, and it told the entire story, not just part of it, but all of it. Henry wrote about the day at the river when Elijah saved Thomas from drowning. He wrote about the night in the woods when Elijah found Thomas beaten and knew the truth about the fight. He wrote about the meetings with the Hayes family and the money he had paid to keep the peace and protect his son's name. But then the letter said something Elijah did not expect, something he had never known. Henry wrote that the night Thomas was beaten in the woods, one of the men with Robert Hayes had pulled a knife. During the fight, Thomas had been losing badly. According to Henry's letter, Elijah had not arrived by accident that night. Elijah had followed Thomas from town because he had been worried about the way the argument ended. He had seen the men stop Thomas on the road from a distance and had followed quietly through the trees. Henry wrote that Elijah had arrived just as one of the men pulled a knife, and that Elijah had stepped in and stopped the fight before Thomas was killed. But Elijah had never told that part of the story. Not to Henry, not to Thomas, not to anyone. According to Henry's letter, it was Thomas himself who confessed this part later, years later, when he was older and finally honest about what had happened that night. Thomas told his father, "If Elijah hadn't been there that night, I would have died in those woods, and it would have been my own fault." Henry wrote in the letter, "So the truth is this. That man saved my son once from the river, and once from a knife, and once from his own mistakes. A man who saves your child 3 times is not a man you can sell. He is a man you owe your life to." Elijah stopped reading for a moment and looked out the window of the cabin toward the hill where the big house stood. He had never known that Thomas told his father the full truth. He had never known that Henry knew everything. He continued reading. The letter went on to explain why Henry had really refused to sell Elijah, even when the plantation was collapsing and he desperately needed money. It was not just because of gratitude that it was because of trust. Henry wrote, "He knows the worst things about my family, and he kept those secrets even when he had no reason to stay loyal to us. That kind of loyalty cannot be bought. That kind of loyalty cannot be owned. It can only be repaid with freedom." Then, near the end of the letter, Henry wrote something else, something Elijah read twice to make sure he understood it correctly. Henry had left Elijah a small piece of land. Not the big house, not the main fields, but the land where Elijah's cabin stood, and the land around it. It now legally belonged to Elijah. Henry wrote, "I could not save the plantation. I could not save my fortune. I could not even save my family name from being forgotten. But I could keep one promise. The land where you live is now yours. Not as a worker, not as a slave, but as the owner." Elijah folded the letter slowly and placed it back in the box. For a long time, he sat in silence. All those years, people had wondered why he stayed. They thought he stayed because he had nowhere else to go. They thought he stayed because he did not know how to live anywhere else. They thought he stayed because he was still tied to the past. But the truth was something else. Elijah stayed because that land was the place where every promise of his life had been made. And now, for the first time, that land finally belonged to him. Not by force, not by law of ownership, but by a promise kept between 2 men over many years. The town would later learn about Henry Caldwell's letter. They would learn that Elijah had been a free man for many years before anyone knew. They would learn that he had been given land. They would learn that he had stayed by choice, not because he had to. And slowly, the story people told began to change. They no longer said, "There was a slave who was never sold." Instead, they began to say, "There was a man who could have left, but chose to stay." And that changed the story completely. Be why the time people in the town finally understood the truth about Elijah. He was already an old man. His hair had turned completely white. His hands were rough and marked by years of work, and his walk had become slow and careful. But every morning, just after sunrise, he still walked the same path he had walked for most of his life. From his small cabin, across the old field, up the hill toward the big house. The house was no longer really a house anymore. Parts of the roof had fallen in. The front porch had begun to sink into the ground. Windows were broken, and the front door hung slightly open, moving a little when the wind blew, making a long, low creaking sound that could be heard from the bottom of the hill. Most people avoided the place, but Elijah walked there almost every day. He would stand on the hill for a while, looking out over the land, the fields that were no longer fields, the road that was no longer really a road, the cabins that had almost disappeared into the earth. If someone had seen him standing there, they might have thought he looked like a man guarding something. But there was nothing left to guard, or at least, nothing that could be seen. Years earlier, after Henry Caldwell's letter became known in the town, people began to look at Elijah differently. For most of his life, he had been someone people did not pay much attention to. Just a quiet man who lived out on old plantation land. Now he had become something else. A story. People from town sometimes came out to the old plantation just to talk to him. Some came because they were curious. Some came because they did not believe the story about Henry Caldwell's letter and the land. Some came because they wanted to hear the story from Elijah himself. But Elijah rarely told the story. When people asked him if it was true that Henry Caldwell had given him the land, Elijah would simply say, yes. When people asked him if it was true that he had saved Thomas Caldwell's life, he would say, I did what anyone would do. When people asked him why he stayed all those years, even when he was free and could leave, Elijah would usually smile a little and say the same sentence every time. Some people spend their whole lives trying to find a place to belong. I was already standing on mine. As Elijah grew older, the town grew too. New roads were built. New houses were built. The world was changing faster now than it had when Elijah was a young man. One day, a group of men came to see Elijah with an offer. They wanted to buy his land. Not just the small piece where his cabin stood, but the surrounding land too, including the hill where the big house stood. They wanted to clear the land and build new houses there. It's good land, one of the men said. Close to town. We can pay you well for it. More money than you could ever use. Elijah listened quietly as the men talked about plans, roads, and new buildings. When they finished, he asked only one question. What will happen to the house on the hill? Elijah asked. The men looked at each other. We'll tear it down. One of them said. It's not safe anyway. Too old. Too damaged. Better to clear it and start fresh. Elijah nodded slowly. I see, he said. We can come back tomorrow with the papers. The man said. You just think about it. This land could make you a rich man. Elijah looked out toward the hill, where the old house stood against the sky. Then he said something the men did not expect. I believe I am already a rich man, Elijah said. The men thought he was joking, but he was not. They left, and Elijah never sold the land. The house on the hill remained standing. Years passed, and Elijah became one of the oldest men in the county. Children in town grew up hearing stories about him. The man who lived out on the old plantation, the man who had once been a slave, the man who had been given land by the same family that once owned him. But the part of the story that people remembered most was simple. He was the man who never left. One winter, when Elijah was very old, he became sick. A doctor from town came to see him and told him he did not have much time left. The doctor asked if there was anyone Elijah wanted to send for, any family, any friends. Elijah thought for a long time before answering. Bury me on the hill, Elijah said, where I can see the fields. The doctor nodded. Elijah died a few days later, quietly, in the small cabin he had lived in for so many years. The town came to his funeral. Not just a few people, almost everyone, because by then, Elijah was no longer just a man who lived outside of town. He was part of the town's history. They buried him on the hill, not in the old slave cemetery at the edge of the property, and not in the town cemetery either. They buried him between the two, on the hill, where he could see both the big house and the fields. Years later, people who passed by that road would see two things on that hill: the ruins of the Caldwell house, and a single grave. Visitors would sometimes ask, "Who is buried up there?" And the people from the town would answer, "That's Elijah. He used to live on this land." "Was he the owner?" visitors would ask. The townspeople would usually pause for a moment before answering. Then they would say, "In the end, yes." But the story of Elijah was not really about land. It was not really about the Caldwell family. It was not really about the plantation. It was about something much simpler and much rarer. A promise. Henry Caldwell made a promise many years ago that he would never sell Elijah. And he kept that promise, even when it cost him money he desperately needed. Elijah made a promise that he would stay and look after what was left. And he kept that promise, even when he was free to leave. 2 men, 2 promises, and a piece of land that held the story of both. That is why, many years later, people did not tell the story as a story about a slave. They told it as a story about a man who was never sold, because he was never truly owned, and about a man who lost everything except his word. And in the end, on a quiet hill above a broken house and empty fields, both of those promises were still being kept, Because some stories are not written in history books. Some stories are written in places. And if you stand on that hill long enough, when the wind moves through the tall grass and the trees begin to move, it almost sounds like two men talking, one making a promise, and the other promising to stay. And that is why the man who was never sold, never left died in the end. The story of Elijah and the Caldwell plantation was not really a story about slavery, or land, or money. It was a story about something much more powerful than ownership. It was a story about a promise. History often tells us about powerful men, rich families, and large plantations. It tells us who owned the land, who lost the land, and who controlled the land. But sometimes, the real story is not about the people who owned everything. Sometimes, the real story is about the people who owned nothing, but still had the power to change lives. Elijah arrived on the Caldwell plantation as a man with no freedom, no property, and no control over his own life. By the rules of that time, he was considered property, something that could be bought and sold. But history has a strange way of changing the meaning of things. Because in the end, the man who was supposed to be property became the only man who could not be sold. Not because of law, not because of money, but because of loyalty, silence, and promises kept over many years. Henry Caldwell spent most of his life building a plantation, building a family name, and building wealth. And like many men of his time, he believed those things were the most important things a man could have. But near the end of his life, he lost all of those things. He lost his land. He lost his money. He lost his plantation. He lost his place in society. And when everything was gone, he was left with only one thing that still mattered: his word. Many years earlier, he had made a promise to a man who saved his son's life, not once, but several times. A promise that he would never sell him. And when the time came, when he was drowning in debt, when he was selling land, selling furniture, selling the lives of other people just to survive, he still kept that one promise. Because in the end, a man is not remembered for how much he owned. He is remembered for the promises he kept and the ones he broke. And Elijah was given freedom long before anyone knew about it. He was given land when he could have left and disappeared somewhere else. He had every reason to walk away from the plantation and never look back. But he didn't leave. And that is the part of the story that matters the most. He didn't stay because he had to. He stayed because he chose to. Because his promise was not written on paper like Henry Caldwell's promise was. His promise was something else. It was loyalty. It was memory. It was the understanding that some places, no matter how painful their history is, become part of a person's life in a way that cannot be erased. The plantation was a place of suffering for many people. It was a place of power for others. It was a place where terrible things happened, and where a few quiet acts of kindness and courage changed lives forever. By the time Elijah died, the plantation was gone. The fields were gone. The money was gone. The Caldwell family name was almost forgotten. But one thing remained. The story of a man who was never sold because he was never truly owned. The story of a man who stayed on a piece of land long after everyone else had left. Not because he was forced to, but because he had given his word. And maybe that is the real reason people still tell this story. Not because it is a story about slavery. Not because it is a story about a plantation. But because it is a story about two men who lived in a time when the world was harsh and unfair, and yet somehow, between them, they made an agreement based not on power or law, but on trust. One man gave his word that he would never sell him. The other gave his word that he would never leave. And they both kept their promises. And in the end, when people visit that hill and see the ruins of the old house, and the single grave looking out over the fields, they are not really looking at what is left of a plantation. They are looking at what is left of a promise. And that is why this story was never forgotten. Because land disappears. Houses fall. Money is lost. Names fade away. But a promise, a real promise, can outlive everything.